Okay, welcome everyone to this session on North America driving the recovery. I want to introduce each of our participants today, and maybe actually allow you to introduce yourself, starting with Harvin Moore from Houston.
Okay, thanks. My name is Harvin Moore. I run a independent nonprofit here called Houston Exponential, which was set up about 3 years ago to address the fact that Houston is a huge and successful economy, and yet from a venture capital perspective, we're relating to technology companies. We were something like 20th in the United States, and that we're not used to that kind of dichotomy. So anyway, we've been working hard as a kind of a convening agent. And grew up in Houston, although I've lived in many other places through my life.
Thank you, Harvin. Mark Schaan from Canada.
My name is Mark Schaan, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister of Strategy and Innovation Policy at the Government of Canada's Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, where overall kind of innovation policy approach for the government and have carriage of a number of important both legal statutes like telecommunications and copyright and intellectual property and competition, but also work on the programmatic and policy structure to help the innovation ecosystem.
Thank you, Mark. And Mark Thomas was in Pittsburgh, but previously in New York City.
Yes.
And I heard Los Angeles even before that, right?
Yeah. So depending on where you are, good morning or good evening. I'm Mark Thomas. I serve as the president of the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, which encompasses 10 counties in southwestern Pennsylvania. I previously worked in leadership roles in New York City and Los Angeles doing ecosystem and innovation work. My job now is to grow our broader economy across every different sector, including tech and innovation, and position our region to be a city of the future.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome. So I want to kick us off by really asking about the specific challenges that the COVID caused to the startups in your regions. And I want to start with Canada and Mark Schaan, if you can help us really understand how it affected the startups, and maybe tell us also how it affected the startups differently, because Canada is a broad, large country, how it affected the different startups in Toronto, which is the leading ecosystem, top 20, versus Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa, Edmonton, and Calgary.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, JF. I'd say, the startup ecosystem was at a bit of a going into the crisis. So we had our best year ever for venture capital last year, and have put in place a number of important kind of programs and supports to kind of continue to grow firms to scale. And then COVID hit. And so I think it really varied. I think, as you indicated, it varied regionally, and it also varied a little bit by sector. And so I think for pre-revenue firms in particular, I think who had just completed a raise, I think there was a bit of a bandwidth to be able to weather the storm. And so we saw some of our kind of leading firms that were, had just kind of come out of some fundraising, that they were in reasonable shape, and were able to draw on some of the additional government supports that were put in place for their efforts. I think for folks who are coming into the end of a round, particularly in segments that are still kind of getting their full maturity, new technologies, some of the work around AI, some of the work around some of the e-commerce platforms other than Shopify, and others. I think you saw some real challenge, and that's where they've had to really draw upon some of the government supports that have been put in place, and have had to go back in some ways to capital raise. And then there's been some really interesting pieces, maybe this is the last piece, which is just some pivots that I think we've been able to see, both some people who've been able to use COVID as an extraordinary kind of launch pad for their efforts. So in the biopharma space in particular, we've seen some extraordinary efforts by companies who've been able to close rounds and gain new customers and new prominence in a way that potentially they weren't before. And then others who've been able to shift their business to do something very different, like the folks who've kind of joined our call to action on the production of PPE or on medical countermeasures. I think that's also been a really interesting kind of measure. So yeah, I didn't fully get to all the regions, but I'd say it varied a lot, and I think was particularly hard for those who were coming to the end of a phase.
Mark, in Pittsburgh, in your activation phase ecosystem, so pretty early, what does it mean for your startup ecosystem? Is it similar to what you heard from Mark, or what are the differences maybe?
Well, so a couple things. So I think startups broadly across the U.S. have taken a hit with the rest of the economy. We were active with our peers in lobbying to make sure they had access to stimulus funding, just to preserve the workforce that they do have. And so that was a collective effort that you saw with chambers and business groups, just so they can survive throughout this phase. The second piece is, you have the startups and you have the startup support groups. Since we are building a lot of that infrastructure, nearly all of those projects are on either paused or have gone virtual or have some delay in our effort. And we anticipate that's going to continue for a while. I will say the caveat is we have a pretty robust robotics ecosystem. They're doing very well. And so that's one area where they're actively hiring. They're continuing to do R&D. A lot of the big enterprise companies are collaborating and investing in them. And so they are in a moment of a good place. And we're
life sciences, you're pretty strong, right? With University of Pittsburgh. I know when I was doing life sciences, I found myself in Pittsburgh actually several times.
Yeah, and so that aspect is continuing to thrive as well. And so to me, I think we think those are two areas that we'll continue to see investment and are ramping up our support to make sure they thrive.
So a mix of challenges and opportunities, really, right? And growth, and maybe in a bigger way than another ecosystem in Pittsburgh because of the strength, the subsector strength that you have. Harvin, Houston is strong in health, but also in many other different subsectors. How is it going?
Better than could be expected, I guess, in some respects. As you point out, healthcare is big in Houston, and that's because of the enormous hospital, patient, and research base of the Texas Medical Center, which is by far the largest medical center in the world. Now, we're light on pharmaceutical. That tends to be in Boston and other places, and so we don't have that end or segment of the industry. But when it comes to patient studies, then we're pretty large on that. Energy has been huge for us in the past, and now, of course, that's switching to new energy or Energy 2.0. But as you know, there was an energy crisis as well on top of COVID, and so there's some upset in that area. And all that said, the segment that kind of has been a little bit surprising is that when Houston got its first unicorn, which happened in January, when a company called High Radius became the first unicorn in the U.S. for the year, it was in fintech. It basically automates accounts receivable so that companies can get their money faster and other services as well. So, we've got a pretty broad scale ecosystem with a lot of B2B based on the fact that we have such a big corporate sector. Anyway, so we've pivoted and we've seen a lot of pivots that we could go into, but certainly it's been a very interesting first half of the year.
Thank you, Harvin. Going back to Mark, and the goal of our sessions, as we have like 1,500 peers today in the different sessions, is really to communicate what are the key initiatives that you've done that they can learn from, really the precise stuff, and really talk about the juicy details sometimes. So Mark Schaan, I wanted to ask you, what is the one policy that you're very proud of? Talking about startup policy, And I know Canada has been very successful with your, fueling the payrolls of SMEs and keeping the employees working. It was a little bit of a hiccup with some of the requirements on revenue or profits, but then you corrected it. What else have you done that others can learn from? What's the one policy that or program or an initiative that you've launched that
I'd say probably,
you're proud of?
I'll cheat and kind of talk about it in two ways. So one is, I think the way in which we did it in Canada approach by trying to draw on all of the various elements of our government departments and our provinces and territories, kind of make that we being robust in all economic responses, whether it was the which is quite but then went quite pivoted to 75% of wages and still continues, the emergency response benefit, the economic business account, and then some supports for venture, in particular the bridge financing program, which I think it was particularly helpful to allow the government to be a backer for people who were completing rounds and ensure that the government's kind of seal of approval was going to be there. But maybe the specific content piece, I'd say, is we've rediscovered. I mean, it was always there, but we've come back to the notion of procurement as an extraordinarily valuable tool in our toolkit to support organizations and entities. And I think it's something we're going to have to take into the post-COVID world. We learned it incredibly well on the PPE and medical countermeasures side, where we in a high-price market where there's tons of competition, we got pretty aggressive and pretty good at doing letters of intent and kind of, sealing deals pretty darn quickly. And I think we'll want to take that out of COVID as well, to remember that a huge way in which we can help businesses is by being their customer, and to doing that in an expeditious and quick way.
Can you tell us more about that procurement
and that kind of built on the
initiative?
foundation of the economic.
Did you accelerate it? Did you expand it? Or how does it work?
Yeah, so essentially between ourselves, our public health agency, Health Canada, and Public Services and Procurement Canada, which is kind of the buying agent for the government of Canada, we were able to put in place a call to action to industry that essentially said, here's a broad-based call. If you've got stuff that you think we need, and if we can identify with our health partners that you actually do need this, we can expedite that process extraordinarily quickly to be able to put in place the mechanisms to be able to get it to where it needs to go. And so, whether that was on swabs or gowns or a whole bunch of innovative kind of measures. And some of it, as I said, was, stuff that was super extraordinarily innovative on the pivoting side. So taking house wrap and turning that into gown fabric, taking airbag fabric and turning that into gown fabric, and being able to do those deals with folks on an extraordinarily rapid basis. So it was kind of a multi-partite effort of a call to action that lived within our organization, and then a buying agent on the hands of our health departments and our public services and procurement agency.
That's great.
To essentially kind of
Mark
provide
Thomas,
that wraparound for where we
what
could
do you want to
demonstrate
share
need and where there
with your peers today? What were you proud of in the last 3 months that they can learn from?
So I would say last 3 months, right? Last 3 months have been kind of crazy. So I've only been.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, I've only been in my role for less than a year. So most of my first 6 months was spent listening, understanding, meeting people, and then mapping out a strategic plan. And so that obviously took a hit. But out of that, what I do think now has more a prominent role in our region is the focus on tech innovation, leveraging kind of the physical infrastructure and neighborhoods to really create the right environment for tech investments across the board. And so we're moving a lot of that early research to public view that people will see over the next 2 months. And so most of my work is still operational, which is different than where I was when I came to New York City, because New York was already like a thriving international tech hub. And so it's kind of building on success versus creating the foundation for long-term success.
Yeah, takes a lot longer to build the foundation, right?
Yeah.
Were you able to accelerate any of these initiatives and programs because of the crisis and how everybody came together to take action, and suddenly government was acting faster and everybody were acting faster?
Well, I would say yes, but we're a small enough ecosystem where I can pretty much get anyone on the phone at any time. So if anything, people have the right mindset. We just need to build out the right environment for growth. And you mentioned life sciences, you mentioned health. Like, we've had announcements all year long of $1 billion from UPMC, Zoom's expansion, Crystal Bio expanding. So we're continuing to work toward building the right conditions for growth. But as far as new initiatives, we're not there yet because we're still creating that foundation, which I think will take another year or so to be at a place that I feel good about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Harvin, what can you tell us that happened in Houston in the last 2-3 months that you're proud of and people can learn from?
Sure. I should begin by saying that just as the United States is more of a bit of a more small government, free market type of a country than a lot of others around the world that have ecosystems and have a lot of economic policy as part of their toolbox, Texas and Houston is even more so, or less so, I guess you could say. So, so the things that we did as a response to COVID here at Houston Exponential were fortunately around further rolling out initiatives that we had put in place the prior year for reasons other than the possibility of global pandemics, because we didn't see that coming as much as we all should have. So for example, Houston is a very large, physically a very large city with, something like 600 square miles and 7 million people in the region. 600 square miles is literally the city limits, whereas the region is bigger than that. So, and when we had the medical center is in one area of town, downtown is a different area of town, the energy corridor where so many of the world's energy companies are located, headquartered, or at least our North American offices are located, is 13 miles and quite a few minutes if you drive there away. So anyway, just to give an example of something that we did is that we licensed a program from a nonprofit in Israel called Startup Finder, which they've used in order to put their ecosystem kind of on the map and to make it easy and more transparent. So we had implemented that or begun to implement it. And in doing that, making all of our startups, as well as our capital providers and our other members of the ecosystem, more easily found, more transparent, what we were essentially doing was making Houston visible and connected within itself, despite being so large and spread out. And also we were making Houston more transparent and accessible to the other places around the country and the world where there is capital, there is talent, and there's those other things, because we are in a flyover state. And so it's important to do that. And so the things that we did very successfully, we're just rolling this out now, but I mean, we've been working on it for 6 months. The things that we did to make our ecosystem more connected, to give us what we call synthetic density, when we are just the opposite of that in terms of being spread out. Those things helped us with the COVID crisis, because we were able to remain connected despite the fact that everyone had to go home. And then the other initiative, which is linked to that, I know you asked for just one, but this is linked to it. Houston is. Can I do that?
Two is great.
Okay, real quick. Houston is not the epicenter of venture capital. Okay, big news flash for those in the audience. And so therefore, our goal is not to build up the number of venture capital funds that are located in Houston, but in fact to attract venture capital funds to Houston. So we can go into it later, but we did a lot of work last year to make Houston very, very easy to navigate and to be kind of a concierge service for VCs from other cities. We call that the VC immersion process, and it's linked to some of these things I mentioned. And that has been absolutely an inflection point. And after COVID, the number of VCs coming to Houston virtually now has just gone off the charts. So we know that's an effective initiative.
Well, that's great to hear. So you took advantage of your program, and then during COVID, of the breaking down of the physical barriers, using virtual to bring more
Jeff,
investors.
JF, we didn't have anything else to do. So yeah, we did. We sat at our house and we worked on these software.
That sounds great. That's awesome. Yeah, this is really interesting to have you guys on the panel, because Canada is much more of a, there's a lot of policies, and the Canadian ecosystem has risen as a result. And Mark comes from New York, which is kind of in the U.S. more on the policy heavy side, right? And the EDC has been able to really enact policy and drive the ecosystem. Now you're in Pittsburgh, which is, kind of in the middle, and Texas is kind of at the other hand. So it's really interesting. But we've seen also that, when I look at the rankings, those cities, those countries that enact great innovation policies have been moving ahead, and the U.S. has been continuing to grow, but at a slower rate, and therefore going down in the ranking. But now, as we all have seen, I'm sure the Kaufman research, entrepreneurship multiplies during the recession. I'm sure you've read of Dane Stengler's research that says I think it was half of the unicorns were created during a recession. And when I looked at the investment made in 2006-07, they had a higher rate of return. And on the 2008 and 9 were a higher rate of return than the ones made before. Valuations go down, people invest less, but actually the returns are higher. So now, maybe turning back to Mark, what are you planning to harness this rise of entrepreneurship, and also the reset, right? Now we're going to be in a recession, and we're going to look at 6 years, 8 years of growth in front of us to get to exit. It's a great time to enact new policies to harness this rise of entrepreneurship as our economies accelerate the transition to a digital economy. What are you planning to capture that?
Since there are two Marks, well, I'm happy to go first.
I was going to go first, Thomas.
Yeah, so what I wanted to add, and kind of continuation of the last question, like if you had just started 3 months ago on innovation thinking and ecosystem building, like you were already behind. And so we had the fortune of mapping out, we know we need policies that make us more competitive. We know we need to drive more investment in anchoring the ecosystem industries that we want to see grow, and creating now this opportunity for remote workers and expansion as a safer metropolitan region in the country. And so we're finalizing kind of what that plan will look like, with the idea that we start to not just socialize that, but arm the state, the counties, the different municipalities I work with the right tools to then move strategies forward. And I think you'll see a lot of U.S. metros will use this recession with lessons from HQ2 and lessons from the last recession to really try to spur more entrepreneurship and population growth within their economies.
Yeah, it's a great time, right, to build your foundation. If you can increase the number of entrepreneurs, it really helps, because that's about the number of startups, really grows the ecosystem, brings investors, brings opportunities. But I think what's very interesting this time is that because of the crisis has called so much to us to help each other and come together, right, like we're doing today, but locally even more than before. Now you have also the chance to bring more mentors around the startups. And people want to help. They want to help for free. People who have been calling me in the last 3 months say, I want to help you for free. What can I do? Right? Which is very interesting, because usually in recession, mentorship goes down. Right? You're like, startups are not going to do well. I'm gonna wait. But now we have all this desire to help. Mark Schaan, how are you harnessing that? What are you preparing, for the next 12, 18 months to really capture all this increased interest and momentum, if I may say? From a low point, but momentum up.
Yeah, exactly. I'd say a few things, I guess. I guess one is, we're going to be pretty determined to carry on with some of what we'd started. So some of this is not losing sight of where we were pre-COVID. As I said, we were coming into our own a little bit in terms of where we'd gotten the ecosystem to. And so can't lose sight of some of the great work we've already done on intellectual property, on continued support on the VC side, making sure that there was access to capital. We'll obviously be working with our partners like the BDC and others to try and make sure that we can continue the engines of growth for the firms, particularly as we've tried so hard to keep so many of them whole all the way through as we've paused the economy. And then we're going to have to be opportunistic as well in a number of ways. So one is on the skills side, being opportunistic about maximizing the talent availability, particularly as it becomes harder to go to other places potentially. I'm not speaking about any
other places south of the border.
But just to suggest that we will try and maximize the talent opportunities that provide for people who might want to, come and work in Canada. And then the second is, I think, being more opportunistic as well about some of these sectors that have really started to do some of the things that we had hoped to do a long time ago. So, this pandemic has done more for digital adoption in the Canadian startup and ecosystem, kind of general small and medium-sized enterprises sphere, than lots of our previous policies, because it's been required to have a digital channel with your customer and your colleagues. And so, I think we'll want to make sure we continue to sort of move that forward. We've put in place an industry strategy council that will kind of that builds on our economic strategy tables. We had economic strategy tables across a whole series of important industries and sectors. For this sort of short term, we've put them all together as the chairs of all of those strategy tables to create an industry strategy council for the minister, to make sure that we're actually going to be able to continue that sort of determined force of where we started, and then second to really look at this opportunism to say, okay, we've seen some new sectors emerge and some areas of Canadian strength that maybe we need to really build on. And then it'll be the kind of core strategies that we've had before: access to skills, access to capital, and access to technology. And how do we continue to drive, that towards access to markets and access to growth? So.
Thank you, Mark. Harvin, what are you preparing with your private corporation and community?
Yeah, sure. I'd say that the two main areas that we're focused on for this year, they're going to sound a lot like what you've heard, are about talent and about access to capital. On talent, I'd say that the COVID crisis in particular has led to, as you know, companies all around the country, especially those, frankly, in New York, notably at least, New York and California, are looking up and saying, it was marginally made sense to be here on a financial basis. I realize for talent, there was lots of talent in those locations, but financially, with the tax load and other situations, just the government policy was making it a little bit difficult. And this may have broken the camel's back for some of those companies. So you're reading about companies obviously looking at their entire idea of their offices and their home offices and how many people are going to the office. They're starting to leave some of those places. And so we know, this has been the case for a while, that our building profiles for people and companies who are leaving, sort of high tax, high regulation states like California and New York, and their interest in Houston, that is increasing. And lots of people are streaming in. So that's one source of talent that we are used to. And then the other source of talent is right here at home. It's from energy. So, we've got a lot of people who are going to be displaced by the changes, which a lot of people think are really more permanent now than ever before in the fossil fuel industry. And so a lot of those people are in Houston. And so new energy, as well as other industries, certainly in the innovation field, can really benefit. I mean, we might as well say it. I mean, there is a way to benefit from that. Those people are going to be looking for other opportunities. And then as access to capital has been mentioned, so we're going to continue to increase our efforts to bring external venture capital to Houston. Now, if you didn't have anything to show them, then it would be kind of a worthless exercise and would not have the kind of success that we've had at getting people to fly down before COVID to look at the deal flow, and now to do these virtual events that we put on. But in fact, it is a funnel. So for 3 years, we've been working on building the startups, startup development organizations, and now we're bringing in the capital. They've got something to look at now.
That's very interesting. So as California and New York City that count a lot on global talent attraction are hurting, you're expecting to have more of a talent flow back to Houston. I imagine in Pittsburgh it's a little bit the same. I see the time is flown away, and that's the end of this session, and soon the end of the conference. I think we'll maybe go join the main stage. Thank you so much, Mark Schaan, Mark Thomas, Harvin Moore, for this session. It was very instructive, and I invite you to all join the main stage for the last words.
Thanks, JF.
I hope you enjoyed the
Much
conference.
appreciated.
Thank you. Bye-bye.